say it to you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out here for the Mob Museum. I'm Zach Jensen, here to welcome you to our lovely air-conditioned building out of the hot sun. So tonight, our program is She Knew Too Much, the tragic story of jazz-age con woman Vivian Gordon. Our speaker tonight is Tony DeStefano. He's a seasoned reporter and a top authority on mob history. He's spoken with us before, so he may be a familiar face to many of you. He has been reporting for Newsday in New York for the past 30 years, and he specializes in criminal justice and legal affairs. He's covered many notable trials, including those of Gambino boss Peter Gotti, Bonanno boss Joseph Massino, and Wall Street Ponzi schemer Bernie Madoff. Tony has also written many books about organized crime, and those include The Last Godfather, Joseph Massino and the Fall of the Bonanno Crime Family, and Top Hoodlum, Frank Costello, Prime Minister of the Mafia. His coverage of human trafficking also led to another book, The War on Human Trafficking. So tonight's topic is the subject of his latest book, Broadway Butterfly, Vivian Gordon, the Lady Gangster of Jazz Age New York. In fact, stick around after the program tonight for a book signing where you can get your own signed copy of his book. So with that, I'd like to invite Tony up to the stage and let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you all for coming. This, as Zach had said, this is probably my fourth or fifth time speaking to Mob Museum audiences. And it's fitting because this book about Vivian Gordon, a woman who certainly knew too much, and she paid for it, was inspired by some of the exhibits here, particularly about prohibition. As Zach mentioned, I worked with Newsday as a reporter, and in my many visits to the museum, I noticed the many exhibits related to prohibition. So I took that back with me, and I said, well, let's do a story about prohibition on Long Island and New York City to sort of amalgamate the two. It was a very important era. And in doing the work, I came across the story of Vivian Gordon, which wasn't her original name. And that is really how this all came about. I came across her murder in February of 1931. I said, what's this all about? And I dug deeper, and it was a fantastic story. Fantastic in the sense that it was one of those rabid tabloid and conventional media stories that just spread like wildfire across the United States, and also led to political ramifications in the history of New York and New York State and New York City. And the result, of course, was the book, which I have now, and I'll switch the slide. She Knew Too Much. This is the book, and Vivian Gordon was really out of the jazz age, prohibition, and depression New York. A lot of the material I got from archives, newspaper archives, obscure court records, and a host of materials that I had to really search long and hard for to find out and find. A lot of the photographs are archival. Some I had to hunt down and I had to purchase the rights for, but they all get woven into the story and make for this book, Vivian Gordon, the Lady Gangster of Jazz Age New York. Now, who was Vivian Gordon? Well, she was born Benita Franklin, and she was out of Indiana, and she was one of three daughters in the Franklin family. There were two other sons, and she was really a convent school-educated young girl. She was sent by her parents to Canada, a school in a town, if I'm pronouncing it right, called Guelph, Canada, a Catholic-oriented town. She may have been a Catholic, but she was really incorrigible, and she really wasn't a very good cooperative student. So she left probably around the age of 17, 18, to seek her fortune. She was an accomplished musician, and she could dance, and she could sing. So what did she do? Like other women of the time, she gravitated to the theatrical trade, the theatrical profession. And she made her way to the East Coast and eventually got some roles in some small productions, an occasional small role in some larger productions. I had to really search to find her name in any production, but she used the name Vivian Gordon, so I searched under Vivian Gordon, of course found nothing for the longest time, until, with the help of the Schubert Organization's archives, I was able to find, if you're able to look at the program bill of something called the Schubert's show, it's really, if you go down to the bottom, you'll see Vivian's name as a character. And this was the Schubert's answer to the Ziegfeld Follies. And these were programs that ran from about 1914 probably till about 1916 or maybe even 18. But Vivian played a role, some minor roles, nothing major, and she wasn't like a big star. Now, there were lots of women at that time trying to make it in Broadway. And what happened, of course, is that you don't all make it. You may be talented, you may have been talented at your hometown, but you're not going to make it, and you're going to have to do something else. Well, for Vivian, she tried modeling, and she had some success. This was a photo taken out of the New York City archives, and why they're in the archives, so we'll get to that later. But she, tried, and she tried as much as she could to make ends meet. But it wasn't enough. And a lot of women at this period of time found that acting with hopes of Broadway careers found that whatever they're doing wasn't enough. Some literally starved to death, some killed themselves, and others just had to go back home to pursue other more mundane and live their lives in decent obscurity someplace else. In Vivian's case, about 1920, she left her husband. She had been married in the interim, took her daughter and came to New York and was arrested for what she claimed was a trumped-up prostitution charge in 1923. Now, her case was prosecuted in this courthouse, which is the Jefferson Market Courthouse. Still exists today. It's an iconic building in Greenwich Village. But she was prosecuted there, and like many, many other women in New York who found themselves ensnared in these kinds of cases, they were victims of police, bailiff, and prosecutor and judicial conniving, in which the women were basically brought in on trumped-up charges and told if you could pay jewelry or money to get lawyers, the case may go away. And a lot of women were able to make that deal, but some couldn't. And Vivian was one who couldn't. So she spent time with 3 years in upstate prison in Bedford, New York. It was a tough time for her. She got released about 1926, and she was a hardened woman. She met women in prison who were really kind of the hallmark of street toughs for women. They were ex-prostitutes, gangster malls, thieves, and she came away, her life was changed at that point. And she came in with Polly Adler, who some of you may realize or remember was the premier madam of New York City in Prohibition. She had notorious brothels, which were very well appointed, and they had a lot of highfalutin, well-moneyed clientele, politicians, sports figures, and whatnot. So Vivian became part of her stable or associated with her, but then she decided, she was going to do her own business. Vivian did, and she became a sexual extortionist. And what does that mean? Well, she would have her own stable of women who went around town meeting men, some of them, many of them very well heeled, often married, who wanted female companionship. And I don't have to paint a picture about what we're talking about here. But some of them would also, at the time of Prohibition, become very drunk. And the taxi cab drivers would take them to Vivian, and the men would then go to a party room with Vivian's women, and they would be compromised, not necessarily sexually, but they would give the women gifts, and they would get into situations which were uncomfortable, particularly for a man of any station. So the deal was, well, you know, we need this, we need that, we need money, and we'll keep this quiet. This is a variation of the old Badger game, which in the Wild West was practiced a lot, but it became the 1920s and Prohibition's own little racket. And Vivian actually had a pretty substantial racket. One of the men, of course, who teamed up with her was Legs Diamond, who's shown in this photograph. And she had associated not only with Diamond, who would split some of the take with her, but also with other gangsters like we have here, the next slide, Arnold Rothstein, the so-called brain of organized crime in the 1920s, who supposedly was doing work with Vivian. There were other gangsters as well, Charles Vonnie Higgins, who was the premier bootlegger, Irish bootlegging gang guy in New York City, and he was very close with Vivian at some point in their career. And all of these people were men of influence in the mob, and they were people Vivian could use to get the right connections and protection if she needed it. Of course, you know, it didn't necessarily often work that way. And at some point, Rothstein, who was killed in 1928, she began to lose some of her protection. Around the same time, Jimmy Walker was elected mayor of New York City. Now, some of you remember Jimmy as the bon vivant mayor of New York City, who was elected, and he was a great guy. Everybody loved him. The press loved him. He was a party guy. He didn't like to work much at City Hall. His desk was a place that rarely saw him. He would spend his time in speakeasies, in casinos, palling around with showgirls, even though he was married. And he was, you know, the jazz age mayor of New York, so to speak. And people just loved him. Vivian, as far as we know, didn't have much of a relationship, if any, with him, but he was the mayor. And I mention him here because his story is intertwined with what happened with Vivian in a few short years. Now, again, Good Time Jimmy, Bo James, seen here with Amelia Earhart. He was like the city's official greeter, the party guy who everybody loved. And, you know, it worked for a while. It worked for a while, certainly since he was elected and took office in 1926. But, you know, we're in a period of time now where New York is getting into a period when people are realizing that the gangster culture is really sort of running their lives. Sure, you had Prohibition and everybody wanted drinks, right? The gangsters were really on high octane with Prohibition, which is, I think, a theme that sort of runs through some of the exhibits here. And of course, with Rothstein dead, with a lot of bloodshed on the street, you just pick up the tabloid papers, you're going to see stories about gangsters killing each other all over the place. The reformists really started to get upset and angry with Jimmy Walker. And they also were angered by this lawless atmosphere which seemed to now pervade New York. And we're talking now about the area of the Depression just setting in. Another scandal that people didn't sit well with people was the disappearance of Judge Crater. The Judge Crater, he's still missing today, by the way. He's now the butt of like late night show jokes because of where is Judge Crater. But his story became another emblem of the lawlessness and criminal element and fear that was beginning to pervade New York deeply at this time. he did associate with Vivian. He did consort with some of her women. He did go to some of her salons, as they were. And he was a known quantity to her and her people. He was also a known quantity to a lot of other people. And when he disappeared in August of 1930, a lot of the reformists in New York City were beginning to feel that they've had enough with Jimmy Walker. So what did that mean? Well, the governor of New York State at that time was Franklin Roosevelt. And he was reading the political winds, and he was sensing that things were not quite right with what was going on with Mayor Walker. He saw certain vulnerabilities, and he realized that the court system in New York, particularly the magistrates' court, which dealt with women accused of prostitution, was in a bad state. That bribery scheme, the fixing of cases that I described earlier, was something that was too much to ignore. So, although Roosevelt didn't have the power at the time, he was able to persuade other officials in the court system to begin an investigation of the magistrates' court, which turns out to be actually pretty revealing. The cops were on the take. The testimony was startling. There were detectives who would shake down women who had no connection with the sex racket. And they would either have to pay or get their reputations ruined by going through the court system. And you know what the court system was like? It was all corrupt at the time. And that was clearly shown in these investigations, which were undertaken by about 1930. And Vivian, of course, felt she was one of the victims of the racket. And this was something that she realized she might be able to do something with. Now, the guy who was investigating these rackets, as it were, was a Samuel Seabury. He was a former judge, blue blood, Episcopal clergy background, very well-to-do, but a man who hated Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall, for some of you who don't realize, was the political organization for New York City for as long as anybody could remember at that point. It controlled politics, it controlled the Democratic Party, and it was involved in the fixing of judgeships, selling of judgeships, the undue influence in cases. So this was an investigation that Seabury was perfect to lead. And he uncovered numerous of cases where the women were being made to suffer false prosecutions. One of them, Vivian, was watching this investigation very closely. And she knew that there was something she might be able to do. She might be able to help Seabury at this point, and certainly his investigation. So she was not in a good way at this point. This photo, taken probably around 1930, 31, shows her as sort of a worn person. She's not the young ingenue who was running around Broadway getting parts and palling around with gangsters. She had a drug problem. She had an alcohol problem. She thought her former husband was part of the cabal that got her arrested in prostitution. And it was a conviction, by the way, that got her to lose her daughter, who was also named Benita. Okay, so where did this go? February 1931, Vivian wrote a letter to Seabury's staff saying, I have some information I'd like to come in and give you. And they said, fine, come on in. He sat down. She sat down with one of the investigators, and she gave information about her husband, ex-husband at this point, a police detective named McLaughlin, and she said, well, they said to her, this is great. This is good information. We're looking at McLaughlin, but we need some more specifics. Can you bring back some more information? She said, yes, I will be able to bring back some more information. And she was supposed to come back about a week later. She never did show. She didn't show for a very good reason. Her body was found on February 26, 1931, strewn in rubble in Van Cortlandt Park. She had been garroted, she had been beaten, and sort of discarded like trash in the ravine in the park. And this, she was very, you can see how the body was at this point, and it was pretty wild. The cops jumped on it right away. The murder, once they learned that Vivian had been cooperating with Seabury, became a point of media hysteria. She was thought to be the victim of corrupt people who were targeted by Seabury. So, you know, it's the old story of the witness who has information and then is killed to be silenced. So that was a supposition. And you can see from these news stories, this is just a minuscule part of the kind of coverage you were seeing. It was hysteria. There were stories in Europe. There were stories in Canada. There were stories in Latin America. There were stories as far away as Alaska, where even with the shipping news being of prime importance was supplanted by stories about what happened to Vivian. The media frenzy continued and reached a new peak when her daughter, Benita, who was 16 years old at the time, said, "I can't take this, what they're saying about my mother, about her being a sexual extortionist, a racketeer," and she just couldn't take it, and she killed herself. She went into the home where she was living with her father in New Jersey. She sealed the doors and windows, turned on the gas, and asphyxiated herself. So at the age of 16, she was another victim of what was going on in this period with Vivian and the scandal that was ensuing. Now, this story talks about a will the young girl had. It really was a handwritten document which really had no legal force and effect. She was 16. It was an unwitnessed, unsigned document. It really had no legal measure. But the story just kept growing and growing and growing because not only was Vivian dead, but a young girl was dead. And one of the newspapers editorialized and saying, there's nothing good about a rope being found around the neck of a woman, especially a woman who was going to be a witness in a criminal case. So everybody thought. Okay. Walker is still the mayor, of course, at this point. He had won re-election about 1929, 4 years after his first election, 25. And everybody's looking around saying, "Jimmy, what are you going to do about this? This city's out of control. You have to do something. You have to take charge." Well, his response was usually to take a vacation. And he would take it to California, Arizona. He went to Germany and France, where they loved him over there, by the way, because he spoke very highly of beer and the fact that he didn't like prohibition and he thought it was a terrible thing. So he got good press coverage in Europe, but back in the United States, the press coverage was terrible. So Roosevelt, the governor, expanded the investigation to Seabury to not only look at the courts, but also to look at Walker's administration, which Seabury did do, and also the way Walker was conducting his financial affairs. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murder of Vivian was accelerating. And this is the police commissioner at the time, and it was hard to find a photo of him, but I found this photo on the wall of Police Plaza in New York City, where they keep all of the former commissioners and chiefs of detectives, arrayed in photographs back to probably 1900. And here he is. This is Edward Mulrooney, who was the police commissioner spearheading the investigation into Vivian's murder. And he was brooking no excuses. He was sparing no resources to get to the bottom of this case. And they thought they had a pretty good suspect. They thought her former attorney and lover, John Radeloff, was a prime suspect. They arrested him as a material witness, but they had to admit they really didn't have anything on him to hold him and to even charge him at that point. Again, you know, we see the from newspaper headlines which show the some of the cast of characters here. McLaughlin was not arrested. He was the cop, but he was disgraced when all the allegations came out about fixing of cases and the pillaring of women on, you know, innocent women. So he had to resign. Ultimately, that's the, you know, with all the headlines, that's the only way you're going to end your career as a cop, in a bad way. So Mulrooney was looking for who the real killer was. So to increase the tempo of the investigation, he put out this chauffeurs cooperation letter, which was delivered to all the taxicab chauffeurs, as they were called in New York City at the time, saying, look, this is Vivian Gordon. She was killed on such and such a date. We're looking for such and such cars that may have, any driver who may have seen anything suspicious. So they, you know, so they spread this around. Did it do any good? Oh, I don't necessarily think so. They got a couple of statements from taxi drivers who thought they saw a woman being bundled into a cab, but it turned out that it wasn't reliable information. Eventually, Mulrooney, the police commissioner, had his own sources. Now, these gentlemen you see here on the, I guess the left of the screen is Frank Costello. On the right is Noel Scaffa, a well-known jewelry theft investigator who had his ways of finding information and probably his own little racket in cahoots with mobsters who were stealing jewelry. Mulrooney went to Scaffa, and it was Scaffa who developed an informant who said that he believed that the jewelry stolen from Vivian, as well as her fur coat, were with found in possession of this fellow by the name of Harry Stein. I think we have a slide of Harry. This is Harry. He was like a ne'er-do-well kind of guy. He had no legitimate occupation. He was a thief. He would occasionally beat women to get money and goods from them. He was charged eventually, based on the information that Scaffa developed, with a murder of Vivian. And he was also charged with another fellow named Samuel Greenberg. This is a Daily News clip which shows Stein, and to the right is the noose that was found around Vivian's neck when she was strangled. So to show you how strange and how primitive the investigation in some sense was forensically, the cops went around town looking for horse stables where they might have found similar kind of rope that was used to lasso horses. And there was no forensic investigation to speak of, no DNA, there was no fingerprints, there was no really sophisticated forensics that we have today, but they were trying to make the case. So they did make a case against Stein and Greenhauer, and they prosecuted the case in Bronx Supreme Court. The cops thought they had a great case. They had a lock. Walker, who was really feeling the heat, said the cops did a great job. Well, there's never a sure thing in criminal justice, because after a trial in the Bronx, where Stein was defended by Samuel Leibowitz, very well-known defense attorney from the time, after that trial, the jury acquitted Stein and Greenhauer. Leibowitz did a very good job. The prosecution had one key witness, a fellow by the name of Harry Schlitten, if I'm pronouncing that right. And he was involved, he said, in picking up Vivian in the car, driving her to meet with Stein and Greenhauer, and under the roost that there was a big stolen gem haul that they were going to try to get part of. And then she was garroted in the back of the cab. You heard her choke and cackle one time, and the cops thought that was great evidence. Well, there's never a sure thing, even with the best of evidence in some of these cases. So everybody was acquitted. Well, certainly these two defendants were acquitted. So Seabury, meanwhile, everybody in the system, including Walker, was stung by the acquittal of Stein for the murder of Vivian, continued his probe of Walker, and he found some very incriminating stuff. It was another tabloid drama. Walker, who had his friends in the press, was looked upon as the guy who was giving as well as he got. Seabury, sort of the patrician kind of guy, was a little stuffy, was not doing so well. But Seabury actually did a pretty good job. And he showed that Walker was taking money from people who were friends, some people who were government, doing business with City Hall. No bribery, he said, but they were just gifts, gratuities. And of course, today this would get somebody indicted probably on a racketeering or a Hobbs Act case. But Walker stood his ground. But Seabury's report made its way to Roosevelt, who was shown here with Walker in happier times. And Roosevelt convened his own special hearing into Walker and found that, look, anybody in government who has money that they can't account for from their salaries or legitimately, you're really going to have to answer for this. And the political drumbeat now was really going against Walker. And this had started with Vivian's death and her daughter's death. And it was really intensifying. This is in 1932, August. There really wasn't much help that Tammany Hall could give Walker at this stage because they knew he was a political liability. So what happened? September 1st, 1932, Walker sent a note to the city clerk saying, "I hereby resign my office." And what did he do? Well, he went on a trip, of course, but he didn't go with his wife, who's pictured here. He went with a woman named Betty Compton, who was a showgirl, and they went around Europe to Paris, Italy, and other places. And then he tried to resurrect his life. He was going to write a book, but that didn't happen. And he died in 1946. Of course, he and his wife were divorced in 1933. What do you expect? This is a very, very public shaming. Harry Stein escaped conviction for Vivian's murder, but he couldn't stay out of trouble, as this slide indicates. He robbed a armored car driver in 1950 who was taking money from Reader's Digest. They killed him. In 1955, after many appeals, Stein was executed in Sing Sing. And that was the end of Harry Stein. I guess karma was its own little payback at this point, because everybody thought he had a hand in killing Vivian. But it took, till 1955 for him to get his comeuppance, so to speak. Now, why am I showing a picture of a grassy plot? Because Vivian was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Hope Cemetery in Hartsdale. Her brother, who came down from Canada right after her murder, was too distraught to do anything more but get a grave. And in researching this book, I came across the grave, but it was unmarked. And the cemetery couldn't find Vivian Gordon because that's not how she was buried. She was buried under her married name, which was Benita Bischoff. And it took me a little while to find that out. And the cemetery said, "Oh yes, Benita Bischoff. She's buried at such and such plot at this location." So I went there expecting to see a stone and monument. There was nothing. This is what we have. This is this plot. And Vivian's grave is to the right of that marker, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen. I decided when I found the gravesite, I said, well, is this right? I mean, she's a murder victim. She's a minor figure in New York's political history, and she had something to do with the drumbeat that ultimately got Walker thrown from office. I said, well, what are we going to do about this? So at that instant, by the way, I was with a cemetery expert. A ladybug, this is a story recounted in the book, a little ladybug alighted on the map where the grave was indicated. And my friend said, that's a sign. I said, come on, this is not a sign from Vivian, is it? I said, that was a sign of something. So I thought about it, and over the weeks and months, I decided, well, I think we have to do something about Vivian's unmarked grave. So I decided that I'm going to place a marker on her grave, and I had to deal with the cemetery. And if you ever had to deal with the cemetery to get a marker at a location, believe me, it's not easy. But after untold weeks and months of pestering them and having to do my own little investigation to make sure there was no other heirs around, they said, okay, you can place the marker. And, you know, it's not terribly expensive. But I hope in the next few months, there'll be a marker at that little vacant grassy spot in Hartsdale Cemetery. And that's, at least, I thought that was the least I could do, you know, after getting a book out of her life. And there's the book. And if any of you have, you know, I have that website. That's my website, TonyDeStefano.com. And you can also see me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, Tony DeStefano. And that is the book. And I'm glad that you are all here to hear the story. It's a truncated, abbreviated story, but the book goes into detail. It's really a police procedural and sort of a quick, breezy history of the Jazz Age in New York, Prohibition in New York, and the sort of early stages of political upheaval, which led to the demise of the Tammany Organization and the reform and the institution of reform politics in New York government. So I appreciate it, folks, and you know, I hope some of you will read the book and enjoy it.
All right, thank you, Tony. So everybody, we have time for some questions. So if anybody has a question, show your hand, and I'll bring the microphone over to you so you can speak into the mic. Question?
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating story. Did your research uncover what happened to Vivian's husband and whether or not he ever publicly said anything about her death?
Vivian's husband died of natural causes in about 1936. He was living and buried in Pennsylvania. He was cleared by police of any involvement in her setup on a prostitution charge. He sparred with his wife, Vivian, for years over custody of little Benita. And ultimately, because of Vivian's lifestyle and the fact that she had a conviction, which she thought was unjust, he got custody. And she tried all sorts of schemes to try to kidnap the daughter and get custody of her somehow, but she never got custody back.
Was Vivian actually known as the Broadway Butterfly, or is that just a name you gave her for the book?
Broadway Butterfly is a name given to a number of women in this period who became famous or infamous while aspiring to become Broadway stars. There was a series of what they call butterfly murders, Vivian's case being one of them, of women who tried to make it on Broadway, but quickly had to make accommodations with rich men who, you know, gave them jewelry, apartments, and nice things. And ultimately, they were murdered. There's 3 or 4 cases where they were murdered. Now, some women, I think the actress Marion Davis was different. She became the lover of Randolph Hearst, and she did very well in her life, and she became a well-known actress in some of the films in the 1930s. But a lot of these women, the so-called butterflies, the Broadway butterflies, as the tabloids called them, just didn't make it. and the most unfortunate, were murdered. And some of these cases are unsolved today.
You said that she had family. Did anybody come forward after the fact, her sisters, brothers, parents?
Her brother, Pierre Franklin was his name, came down from Toronto or Montreal after she was murdered, and basically went to pieces. He had a nervous breakdown. He was the only person stepping forward to do anything about her interment at the cemetery. He bought the plot, obviously. She had two sisters. They passed away by about 1960, possibly a little earlier. The brother passed away in 1963, I think it was. And I had to do a search through Ancestry and other sources to find out what happened to her family. Her daughter's dead. Her husband divorced her, so there was no husband. And in New York State, there's a hierarchy of who can place a memorial or who can take care of a grave. And you go through them all. I'm not saying this the exact order, but there's the spouse, the parents, the children, brothers, sisters, and there's a whole, including the executors. There's a whole hierarchy, and anybody else who has an interest. Well, I suppose I'm one who has an interest. So the cemetery was satisfied with the work I did to try to hunt down any other family. But then again, they're constrained by the state hierarchy of legal succession, as it were. So, here I am, finding a grave and putting up a headstone.
All right. Well, let's give Tony another round of applause.
Thank you.